Good day everyone, so we'll be discussing the highest level of play in Genshin Impact, so let's quickly define it. It is essentially a set of practical principles and reasonable execution standards that achieve the most effective outcome in the most consistent manner. And I'll sort of show an infographic in just a bit to sort of explain this in more detail, but what this practically means is that at the highest level of play in Genshin, we worry about things like the order in which we execute our abilities, how we position, what type of animation cancelling we do and we don't do, our stamina management, iframe usage, the gearing of our characters, understanding and abusing of enemy eye movements and cooldowns, etc., all in such a way such that we can get a very good effective outcome in a consistent way. So what do we mean by this? Well, to demonstrate, I've actually drawn up a Genshin skill to reward curve, which I have explained months ago, but I think it's kind of relevant to bring this curve kind of back. And as you'll see, we've got two y-axes here. We've got effectiveness, which for this example, you can assume is DPS or how fast you can clear the Spiral Abyss, though it's not necessarily tied to those concepts in theory. And obviously on the other side of the y-axis, we've got a consistency measure here. So I'll explain all of this, but essentially what happens is as a player, you've got a certain amount of skill, as you can see on the x-axis, and by you pressing random buttons in the game, there is a minimum amount of effectiveness or DPS that you can get out just by literally pressing random buttons in random orders. You are right here at the bottom at the low end of the skill curve and of effectiveness curve. Now as you progress in Genshin Impact, you might start noticing certain patterns, you might start understanding how the game works, and in a certain sense, no matter how you sort of press buttons, you'll find that your outcomes are pretty similar-ish sometimes, but your consistency will sometimes just be a bit all over. So what we mean by consistency in this case is how variable your effectiveness is. So if you can think of effectiveness as the average kind of like damage that you're doing, you can sort of then think of consistency as being how variable that average is dependent on your skill. This is, I know this might be a bit tricky to understand, but it's really not that difficult. The point here is that a lot of people at the majority of the skill bracket in Genshin Impact achieve a routine sort of effectiveness, and most of the time they're content with it. Some people have better skill, so this is where we get to the higher level of play, and at the highest level of play what you find is that your effectiveness really starts ramping up by quite a bit, and also the consistency in which you can get this higher amount of damage also becomes apparent. You know exactly which abilities in which order to execute, you know where to stand in position, how to iframe, how to abuse some of the enemy's mechanics and so on. And this is what we mean by high level play. It's this little bracket here that essentially signifies that for a highly skilled player you can get the most effectiveness in the most consistent manner. Of course, we recognize that the game has an element of RNG, so as you try and push more and more and more damage, even with like maximum skill, you'll find that sometimes you can become more inconsistent, and this is just due to the randomness in the game. Unfortunately, your consistency can drop if you try to go for maximum effectiveness, but that is something that ties more into a speedrunning world than what we're really sort of talking here. So why is this important? Well, this kind of Genshin skill to reward curve is very important in understanding how we evaluate and judge characters. So for instance, a lot of people at the lowest skill level might say, ooh, Yaimiko, E, 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 Q, E, 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 no iframes on her E and all this good nonsense, and they will forever be stuck in this sort of lower skilled sort of bracket. And there's nothing wrong in being a lower skilled player. It just means that it's not a very good way of judging a character, because a character's potential is arguably best articulated or sort of actualized, that's the word, once that character is being played at a higher skill level. So for instance, understanding how to position with the eye, how to set up your turrets and what buffs and debuffs to apply, how to animation cancel, not animation cancel, to dash after your E ability, how to position with your E ability so that you can avoid things proactively and position to the next place very, very rapidly. These are things that makes Yai Miko, for instance, a very high skilled character. Positioning, all those things we listed in the beginning are so important, and a lot of people are still just focused on the bare basics, and they judge the character really unfairly on this basis. And it's the same with Nilo, and I want to sort of give you an example of why people get this wrong. Right, so as an example, you'll see a demonstration from me using my abilities in sort of the correct way, sort of as how you'd expect an average content creator or an average player to sort of be playing this sort of Nilo team and so on. And I want you to notice a couple of things. So right off the bat, we start off here, we sort of tag all the enemies as we should, we cast elemental burst, everyone's going to get an EM buff, Kokomi's on field, Kolei's little Dendra application is there, kind of missed, but hey, let's assume it would have been perfect. You can see here we are hitting more and more enemies, we're tagging all the wolves, everyone's coming in. So as you guys can see, it's not the worst sort of gameplay ever. It looks kind of successful. We're hitting all the enemies. The wolves are being hit, and that is about 30 seconds or so that we've cleared this floor. However, if you think back to the graph here, this is a very good example of mediocre skill and not the high skilled gameplay that we want to see. And the only way to sort of make it clear, instead of like breaking it down bit by bit, is to sort of show you a sort of good run, which is the one I did in the little previous video. So let's analyze that same floor again. So right off the bat, you can see a very, very fast ability, execution there, positioning more towards the edge of the corner, understanding how we can use all of our abilities, tagging all of the enemies, Nilo sort of hitting everyone in AoE, Kokomi here, and just reapplying a bit of the Hydro, quick cancelling of Kokomi's elemental burst, now applying Nilo's burst, and look at that, the Kole, of course, for the additional bit of Dendro, and now we can beat the floor. So the difference is 5 seconds, but you could definitely feel the difference. You could definitely feel the difference in deliberateness of actions being applied, and this is what we mean by saying the highest level of skill. Once you use a character like Nilo towards her maximum potential, that is when you can judge the viability of the character. That's when we can start making assessments such as whether Nilo sort of needs Nahida or whether she is just good as is with the Traveler. So at the highest level of play, we've sort of really stripped out all of the inconsistency aspects of the game, and we now have a proper framework for judging certain things. So for instance, with the question that I just said, if I wanted to assess how viable Nilo was with the Traveler, what I would do is I would say, well, what would be Nilo's best in slot team? Well, okay, obviously we know it's Nilo, Nahida, Kokomi, and then depending on situation, it could be Kole or the Traveler, though I'd argue it is Kole. And what we would do is we'd take a team like this and we'd say, right, what would be the difference if we swapped out Nahida and we played the new team with the Traveler now at its maximum potential? And then we'll go to another meta team, let's say like the Raiden National, and we'll take out Raiden and we'll put in Chongyun, and then we'll play again that team optimally and we'll assess sort of the performance. If the performance loss in a meta team comp like the Raiden National is, let's say, 15%, and let's say the Nilo teams is also 15%, then we know that the result of taking out Nahida and putting in Traveler leads us to an outcome that would have been expected in any case. So you cannot then say that Nilo needed Nahida when the alternative, when I look at other team comps, would have given more or less similar outcomes. In many, many different ways, you could even then argue that if that was less, so for instance, let's say the damage loss was only 10% instead of the expected 15, you might then argue that, yeah, Nahida is an upgrade, though not a necessary upgrade. And hence, when people say sentiments like Nilo is nothing without Nahida and Kokomi, we've got a solid basis of proving them wrong. And if they do make those statements, you can then justifiably ask them, what is your proof? What is the way in which you sort of judge this? Now, I know a lot of people might say, well, yeah, the big elephant in the room is the Raiden National does more damage than this team. which is also once again not necessarily true. It can be dependent on circumstances, and yes, there will be circumstances where a Nilo team will underperform, especially in very strong single target sort of environments. You're right, at national team, but once again, we would have to see what the builds are. We'd have to make sure that the comparisons are fair. We'd have to look at using GC sim and so on, at the distribution of damage, which is in essence an encapsulation of this idea of effectiveness versus consistency, with the third dimension, of course, being skill being accounted for. And then you can make proper judgments on which sort of teams and so on to use. I think honestly Nilo is in a very, very good spot. At the highest level of play, she is certainly very, very good, and I think a lot of people are unfairly judging characters like her and Yaemiko, and I think through some artificial means, so for instance with the inclusion of spread reactions and so on, people come to the conclusion suddenly that, for instance, Yaemiko is good, whereas the things that made her good were always present. It's just that no one truly played her to the highest degree possible. Yes, once you play it at the highest level, her performance was subpar, now it's on par, and it's the same here with Nilo. Once you play her at the highest level, she's I think in some cases a lot better than just being on par with a lot of the popular teams. So to wrap up this video, in essence we want to play at the highest skill curve here in Genshin Impact, precisely because this allows us to get a much more fairer and accurate view as to a character's potential, and we can also then start quantifying exactly how good one character is with regards to another. It enables us to answer a lot more questions in a much more consistent and fair way, instead of just having sort of very sloppy execution and then having half-baked opinions sort of built on top of it, which is what you see all over YouTube, Reddit, and all of the social media. So yeah, this has been my little presentation of this. Tell me what you think in the comment sections down below.